Hello, everyone. Welcome to this lecture in our series on political science. Um, we are going to follow up our previous lecture with a lecture on John Locke, and the reason why I say that is because Hobbes and Locke represent really two sides of the same coin. This is because Locke lives through the same series of events that Hobbes lives through. They look at the same series of events, but unlike Hobbes, Locke gathers a completely different conclusion. And part of this is because being younger than Hobbes, he's able to live to see the conclusion of the English Civil War. He's able to live to see what happens after in the Glorious Revolution and live through that period in English history as well, where you see a peaceful transition of power into a different kind of monarchy, and in particular one in which a predominantly Protestant and Anglican country is living with a Catholic king. And this is important because it really starts to show the limit of power and authority, and it really enshrines the idea of religious liberty because, this may seem new to us, this may seem a given to us, but this was profoundly new for the period of time. And so it's really important to understand that, Locke is able to gather a more nuanced perspective on this. Now, in order to really understand Locke, we need to start with this first quote, which is, political power I take to be the right of making laws with the penalty of death, and consequently all less penalties, for the regulating and preserving of property, and employing the force of the community in the execution of such laws, and in defense of the Commonwealth from foreign injury. And all of this for the public good. And that last line is really important. All of this for the public good. Unlike Hobbes, and more so unlike Machiavelli, Locke views power as a responsibility more than a privilege, more than a sort of a free rein in exchange for security. Political power comes with it a whole series of duties that need to be fulfilled, and all of that needs to be done for the public good. And so just to recap this, just so you understand, both Hobbes and Locke are trying to explain politics through the similar thought process. In fact, both of them look at and use the state of nature as their framing device. Locke, like Hobbes, also starts from a state of nature. And as we said, the state of nature is this idea of imagining human behavior without government, without society, without any of these things, to really gain a sense of what human behavior looks like. And as we said, for Hobbes, this is inherently violent. The state of nature is a state of war of man against man. But that's not really the case for Locke. For Locke, it's really a state of curiosity, a state of unorganized chaos, but not violent chaos necessarily. And so let me give you an example here. Let's say that at a very particularly busy intersection, immediately, flick the switch, state of nature comes into place, and the traffic light stops working, and we all try to go at once. And there's really no way to guarantee our passage safely through the intersection. Now, it's not in the realm of normal human behavior to get out of your car and pull out a baseball bat and bludgeon the other drivers to death so that you can make it through. But that's sort of what Hobbes is implying that we are, right? That we are inherently evil, that we are inherently bad, and that without government to keep us in check, that's how we behave. But that's not really a reflection of reality, according to Locke. And instead, he says, he sort of starts from the same point, which is that to understand political power aright and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of another man. A state also of equality, wherein all power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another. So what he's saying is, in that in this state of nature, like Hobbes, you sort of see a state of absolute freedom, perfect freedom, where you can do what you want, and yet there is still a law here. There is a law of nature. As he continues, he says, though this may be a state of nature, it's not a state of license. Though a man in that state has uncontrollable liberty to dispose of his person and his possessions, he is not at liberty to destroy himself. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that all being equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So what he's saying is that even though in the state of nature we can do everything, that doesn't mean that we actually do everything. And that there's sort of like a moral line, if that makes sense. In that there is, so the example that I give is, you can engage in all of these bad behaviors, but you don't need a government to tell you that that's wrong. You know instinctively that what you've done is wrong. So you know instinctively that, for example, murdering someone and taking their stuff is wrong in a state of nature. You know that instinctively. You don't need a government to tell you, hey, that's wrong, that's illegal, don't do it. You already sort of know that. And that's the law of nature. And that's really important because immediately what we've done is that we've established that a state of nature is not, unlike what Hobbes would say, a state of lawlessness. It's a state of freedom, but freedom is not lawlessness. And so the state of nature follows the law of nature. And it's called various ways in the text. You can also find it called natural law or God's law, etc. The concept is the same. And we instinctively know what this law is and how it works. We can't even always express it, but we instinctively know that. Now, that doesn't mean that violence doesn't exist in the state of nature. It does. But we know that that's bad. We know that that's wrong. And so we try not to do it. Now, he says, for men being all the workmanship of an omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, all of the servants of one sovereign master, sent into the world by his order and about his business, they are his property, whose workmanship they are made to last during his, not one another's pleasure. So what he's saying is, for the similar reason we understand that killing each other is wrong, we understand that taking each other out as slaves is also wrong, because we are removing someone from the possession of God, in this case, an infinitely wise maker. And that means that enslaving someone in a state of nature is equally wrong. Just as in this case, everyone is bound to preserve himself. So suicide's also not an option. So be the like reason, when his own preservation comes not in competition, ought as much as he can to preserve the rest of mankind, not unless to be to do justice to an offender, take away or impair the life, or what tends to the preservation of the life, the liberty, health, limb, or goods of other. He says, not only do you have a responsibility to steward yourself, to ensure that yourself stays safe, that your stuff stays safe. You should, when you're not in danger yourself, to preserve everyone else's life and stuff, and do justice to the offenders who violate the law of nature. We understand that to be wrong, right? When somebody kills someone in front of us, we want to do justice to them. That is what Locke is saying. Men living together according to reason and without a common superior on earth, with an authority to judge between them, is properly the state of nature. The state of nature is not anarchy, the way Hobbes says. Instead, it's just men living without a common superior power with them on earth, without an authority to judge them. That's the state of nature. But force or declared design of force upon the person of another, where there is no common superior on earth to appeal to for relief, that's a state of war, not a state of nature. Want of a common judge with authority puts all men in a state of nature. Force without right upon a man's person makes a state of war both where there is and there is not a common judge. So what he's saying is that the world that Hobbes describes exists. Only Hobbes calls it a state of nature, and Locke calls it a state of war. But inherently speaking, this is an aberration, right? A state of war happens when something goes wrong, when this shouldn't happen, when someone has violated natural law, thus triggering a state of war, right? That's not the rule, though. That's not the norm. The norm is sort of this unorganized state of nature. And the state of war happens when, something has gone horribly, horribly wrong. And so just to recap this, Locke disagrees that a state of nature sort of just becomes a state where everything is permitted. It can occur, violence can occur, but we all understand that these are wrong, and we try to punish those who break this sort of unwritten rules. The state of nature is therefore not a state of war, it's just a state of unorganization, right? There is no organization, no principles, no ruling authority to govern our lives. Everything is unorganized. If the traffic light stops working, we don't go out and bludgeon each other to death, but we also have a hard time making it through the intersection because there's no organization there, right? So we all try to go at once and we're all a little confused and we don't know what's going to happen, right? But we sort of get by, but it's not ideal. But the question is, if the state of nature isn't anarchic and dangerous, what's the incentive to leave it? Right? What's the incentive to give up your freedom and join society if the state of nature is so tolerable? This leads into the important element of Locke, and that's property. Property is the key understanding of Locke. And so picture this. Here we have an apple tree in a field, and this is the classic example. How do we distinguish a wild apple from an apple that's yours? Well, or perhaps a better question, how do you distinguish an apple tree that's wild from an apple tree that's yours? Well, the example here, using Locke's equation, this is sort of what we get. Property is things that nature has provided plus your labor. So for example, an apple that you find in the wild is wild, it belongs to everyone. But the minute you pick that apple, you're applying your labor to it, and therefore that apple becomes yours. And if you take that apple and then you plant it in your backyard, that's your apple tree because you have applied your labor to it from something coming out of nature. Now this is a simple example, but what Locke says is a clear case is the example of land, right? If you find unattended land and then you apply your labor to it, that land becomes yours. Now Locke's inspiration for this, keep in mind, he writes this during the 1600s, is what he perceives to be this uninhabited frontier in the colonies in the West. What he perceives to be in the Americas, this, quote, uninhabited, end quote, area of land where colonists could go and apply their labor to nature to create property. So here's what he says. He says, though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. You own yourself and you own your labor. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state of nature, the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with it, and joined to it something that is his own, and therefore makes it his property. Right? You own your labor, and so when you take something out of nature, you are combining it with something that you own, and therefore that becomes your property. And this is important because, like Hobbes, Locke also agrees that society comes out of voluntary agreement. It's a voluntary agreement that gives political power to governors for the benefit of their subjects and to secure them in the possession and use of their properties. That's the big one. Societies exist and are formed not as a way to secure our lives, but as a way to secure our properties. They are designed to protect us, our freedoms, and our properties, and enforce the natural law from those who would break it. And that's the big one, because it's so unorganized. It's very difficult to say where my property begins and yours ends. And so society exists as a voluntary agreement that we all join in order to live better lives. That's the goal. The goal of society is not to protect us, it's so that we can live better lives. Now, protecting us is a part of that, but it's not the entirety of that equation. And so Locke summarizes this idea broadly into three rights that the government needs to ensure for us: life, liberty, and property. So, any guesses what the founding fathers were reading? Well, now you know. They were reading John Locke. They just changed property to pursuit of happiness, but the concept is the same. So why these three in particular? Well, the government has to maintain your life because taking it violates natural law. It has to ensure your liberty because you are the fruit of God's labor. Remember that previous slide. And therefore you are his property. And so by removing your liberty, by enslaving you, I'm sort of stealing from God, right? If that makes sense. I am removing property from God. And lastly, property itself, because stealing from you violates the social contract, which is the reason why we enter into these voluntary agreements. And so that should give you a sense of how Locke views society instead of Hobbes. It's much different and it's far more nuanced. That doesn't mean necessarily correct. It depends on how you view people. If you tend to be more cynical, you tend to agree more with Hobbes, that people are just bad people and we need government to keep us in check. Locke is far more optimistic about people. That doesn't mean purely optimistic. It doesn't say people are great. Violence does happen. But that we enter into government, into society, because we want organization in our lives. And that's the big one. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that was clear for you all. If you have any questions, email them to me. I'm happy to get back to you as soon as possible. And I think that's it. That's the end of the lecture, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.